This week's podcast is from a conversation I had with Alex Zhang, recorded in person at the Unfinished Live conference. Alex Zhang is the mayor of Friends with Benefits, or FWB, a prominent DAO of creatives. Before we get further into FWB, let's first hear more about Alex.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to the Unfinished crew. This is a pretty amazing venue and space, and I've just run into so many new and old friends already that I can tell it's going to be a pretty special event. My background and I guess how I got into Web3 or even Friends with Benefits, as a relative latecomer, I got involved about a year and a half ago into sort of crypto and Web3. My background has always been in sort of cultural and social networks, so I've always been interested in the intersections between people, live experiences, concerts, festivals, experiences, nightlife, hospitality, as well as like technology, and how each could sort of accentuate, amplify, and drive stronger connections to the other. That showed up in previous chapters where I worked with artists and musicians as a curator or as an artist manager, or always sort of an advocate for how artists could sort of expand their reach and their impact and their footprint, as well as always just as a kid who grew up on the internet, interested in the fundamentals of technology and the internet and social networks and how technology could sort of scale connection in sort of unprecedented ways. And so that sort of perfect, I guess, like cocktail of ingredients led to obviously finding crypto and the blockchain to be really, really interesting as it sort of serves as this underlying decentralized database or structure to every industry or every facet. And I specifically got interested in it when I started to see potentials where I could sort of drive human connection or drive authentic connection or drive community coordination at a larger scale. My previous project and community before Friends with Benefits was Summit Series. We were a global events and community organization that had hosted festivals and conferences all around the world, and most notably came together to crowdfund the purchase of a ski resort, Powder Mountain, a 10,000-acre ski resort in northern Utah. And so just massive human coordination efforts have always fascinated me. And to me, crypto is just a giant coordination tool, and sort of an insertion of a financial layer to that, which, as we know, can be quite an interesting incentive for groups of individuals.
It's interesting that you did this crowdfund of a ski resort without crypto, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's very similar to what's been enabled by different DAOs. Like we've seen kind of different similar efforts happening with DAOs. Just like thinking about your past experience with that, like how do you think that would have been different with like Web3 tools?
Yeah, no, that was definitely one of the first applications where it was traditional capital raised. It was unique in that it was crowdfunded. Mm-hmm. So from about 130 community members, we had raised about $45 million to acquire the ski resort and the operating company in the land. And it was until I started getting really interested in DAOs as organizing frameworks, the governance side of it, the sort of the transparency side of it, that I started to draw some interesting connections where, I don't think crypto solves everything. Mm-hmm. It creates a lot of problems, often more than it solves, but in certain instances, just like the hypothetical scenarios of transparency and on-chain records of funding moving from point A to point B, I think would be really interesting in fundraising large-scale projects. I think attributing governance on-chain as well, so there can be sort of a record of collective decision-making about how certain things are developed or certain things are done would be interesting as well. But yeah, definitely the ski resort fundraising project was like a pre-DAO, pre-crypto fundraising project, as that was done in like 2013, 2014. And now seeing and assisting and supporting a lot of my peers in the Web3 space who are fundraising large land protection programs, or let's all raise money by the Constitution. It all feel a lot of those similar mechanics, which to me just represent a more abstracted layers of communities wanting to work together to accomplish things together, right? To create communal artifacts, to create communal experiences, to identify opportunities that through a more collective cooperative mindset would lead to more significant or interesting outcomes. Crypto as just a financial instrument to accomplish that has been an interesting theory to watch play out.
Yeah. So how did you come to learn about FWB and become involved in it?
Yeah, so I had known a lot of the different folks who were swimming in and around the Web3 space as it was kind of picking up about 2 years ago, and NFTs started to really, land on an exciting form factor. I think just for quick context and background to FWB, it started completely as an accident and as a social experiment of the internet, in that its founder, Trevor, who's a good friend of mine, who's always been interested in sort of new media projects, cultural projects. He started Lil Michaela, that like virtual influencer, if you've seen her on the IG. But he, over the course of a weekend, created the FWB token, an ERC20 token that sits on the Ethereum blockchain, and sent it to a bunch of his friends, and tweeted, hey, if anyone's interested in crypto and wants to come at it from sort of a cultural lens, just DM me. And so he sent this token to a bunch of people. If you held this token, you got to join this Discord chat. And this was sort of in the peak of COVID. And I think what it struck was a couple of things. I think one, obviously, like in COVID, everyone's constructs of community was greatly challenged or non-existent. And so this thing where you could kind of tap into something that felt communal, I think struck a chord with a lot of individuals. And then second, it became this sort of place to make sense of what was happening in the larger Web3 ecosystem. I think if we all recall back to 2020, and it was just all the headlines were just about this NFT sold for $7 million or this thing happened. But we were like, where's the substance, and how is this actually working? How what's not working, and where's the place to kind of stumble and learn? And FWB kind of organically became this sort of bootstrap social network that sat on top of a Discord to solve and answer some of those questions. And so I was just one of the few folks who joined early on as someone who was curious about how DAOs could present new organizational frameworks to collectives and to communities. And I remember within 2 weeks, I hadn't felt like I'd had that much fun on the internet since I was a kid, where it felt like early chat rooms that I would hang out in, or internet forums, or music blogs. People were reaching out, and you were connecting with them on so many deep levels, where within a few conversations you found out you had actual mutual friends. It really felt like the early internet days, where you just found yourself in a weird sort of corner of the internet of a bunch of people who had the same level of curiosity and interest, as opposed to, I think, our current social media environments, which feels like we're just hanging out in these sort of giant faceless town squares where everyone's kind of like yelling at each other or showing off or something. And so that contrast, I think, got me hooked. And I just reached out being like, hey, I want to get more involved. And then within a couple of weeks, was sort of the first person to jump in the mix full time or whatever, as the CEO or as the mayor is my title, to just help think about what FWB is or was or could be.
So interesting. So in this kind of early community, I guess the difference to just like a regular Web 2 or traditional social media community really was, there was a token. Because like Discord is a Web 2 app, and you're just people congregating online, chatting. So what do you think, what about having a token in this community? What made that kind of things, how did that impact?
Yeah, I think really more than anything beyond the financial was really, I think, the philosophical construct of ownership, right? And I think what it was sort of contrasted to was everyone's sort of experiences in a lot of the existing social media environments, where we're populating the content, we're creating the content, we're the ones bringing value to these environments, specifically creatives or artists who are really creating unique, sort of content on these platforms. And we were really interested in how do you actually ascribe value to that content that's being generated on these networked platforms? And because the last decade has kind of demonstrated that the most efficient or only existing model is an advertising-based model, we wanted to sort of posit another model in which by holding a certain number of tokens representing your ownership and your stake or your vote in this community, that would introduce and incentivize one to further create more meaningful experiences and content within that medium or within that sort of framework. And so, to date, FWB has been mostly bootstrapped on top of existing Web2 platforms, but clearly I think what it represents beyond that is just this notion of, are there other alternatives to social networks in which its users can participate on a more fundamental ownership level of it? And will that drive more healthy or interesting or collaborative outcomes through that ownership mechanic?
If you could kind of compare in simple terms the business model for Web2 social media versus what the business model for Web3 social media is becoming, because I don't think we've come to like an answer like this is what it's gonna be, but like what has it been so far for Friends with Benefits?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many speakers here at this conference that I think even helped build or critique the existing Web2 social media sort of business models and the implications that have sort of arose out of that. But at its fundamental, sort of free to use, and the revenue generated to sustain the operation just comes from advertising, targeted ads and data, and the data that you're creating and populating through these sort of network graphs that are populated on a privately owned company and server. Mm-hmm. And so I think with Web3, a couple of things that are interesting is one, all the activity and sort of the network effects, a majority of them are occurring on chain, right? People sending assets, NFTs, tokens, things to each other, so that being publicly queryable information. And then two, as you mentioned, we are still incredibly early. There hasn't been really a proven model, but the alternatives to through the sort of ownership of tokens or the conversion of whether you're buying an NFT or buying a token, presenting new models, either more sort of progressive like DeFi models of sort of staking and yield that just accrue revenue in interesting ways, especially in more active or bull markets. But even on a more fundamental user level, insert the whole Kevin Kelly 1,000 true fans sort of framework, which is if you just have 1,000 people paying a more meaningful sum, a creator or an individual can totally live and sort of subsist off of that, and not necessarily needing to create an organization that exists to drive insane amounts of profit margin to shareholders, but instead think about what's a revenue model that can generate enough revenue to operate and maintain the protocol or the infrastructure in which we sort of exist and operate inside of as users of a social network. So I think that's being demonstrated through a lot of interesting NFT projects in which you purchase an NFT for some amount of Ethereum. That money goes into the treasury that the community is able to own. Anytime that NFT is bought or sold, there's a 5%, 10% resale value that goes back into the treasury to the artist. So there's always sort of this perpetual revenue mechanic that allows for the organization to sort of continue to accrue value and as a group vote to determine how those funds are allocated and spent to ideally benefit and improve the infrastructure of its users. And so, yeah, still quite early, but at least I'm most interested in seeing the projects that are trying to seek alternatives beyond just data-driven advertising to keep the lights on.
In the last 10 years, over $100 billion worth of crypto has been lost or stolen, specifically because of poor key management, scams, and hackers. My new sponsor, ZenGo Crypto Wallet, wants to change the game entirely by creating a crypto wallet with no private key vulnerability. ZenGo aims to be the most secure Web3 wallet and the best place to keep your crypto, NFTs, and assets secure. After all, with no private key to steal, your crypto assets and NFTs are much more difficult to hack. Get started at zengo.com/Defiant and use code Defiant to get $20 back on your first purchase of $200 or more. That's cengo.com/Defiant. Terms and conditions apply, so check out their site for details.
Friends with Benefits first started as an experiment when its founder minted and distributed the FWB token and ERC20 token to an early community. The handful of holders of FWB were then eligible to join a Discord channel and gain access into chat groups. That developed into a community of thousands of members, live events, and now even proprietary software. Alex goes on to explain the evolution and growth of Friends with Benefits.
So that was the early sort of framework, and we were just curious to see sort of what would happen. I think a lot of us had come from nightlife and cultures, and we were like, this is a digital club. What's the line look like outside the door? How do you bring artists to the back door? What's the club dynamics that could exist online? Once we had sort of clearly defined that, we were like, all right, this is way more interesting than just building a cool little thing that happens, one night of the week. And instead started to look at, what are more interesting models for sort of more evergreen, proliferation or growth. And first, it was really just looking at what was organically happening. And so what happened was after we started with a couple of these channels inside of a Discord, and community members just started to create and propose the formation of their own and new channels. So all of a sudden, there were hundreds of channels, from trading to lifestyle to art, art gallery exhibition openings in cities. And it started to become, just what anyone who's gone down rabbit holes of internet culture has seen before. And it felt really reminiscent of that. We then started to put and layer on a more formal governance process around that. So, okay, now that there is some sort of like token velocity movement here, and at this point it had like 300, 400 people hanging out inside of this chat. What does it look like to begin to allocate resources to certain things that we'd all find interesting? From acquiring assets that we all get to share, digital or physical, to one of the first things was throwing our first event. And so last year in Miami, when it was still probably contentious to throw an event, community members came together during, I think there was some conference in Miami, and we rented out a super small bar, asked our friends, Yves Tumor to DJ and Jubilee and a bunch of friends. And what we saw was fascinating, where you needed to hold tokens to get into this physical club or this bar. And there were like 800 people outside the bar trying to get in. And token price was moved like 10% over the course of 4 hours. And we were like, there's some really interesting mechanics here. And I think we were one of the first to do token gated experiences, like physical experiences, especially coming out of COVID, and catching that wave sort of early. And so that was sort of a huge flag in the ground in terms of, oh wow, this community is more than just a Discord chat. This is actually a group of people who are using Discord as a medium, but also a huge subset of people come from a background of, event, concert, festival, hospitality production, and began to throw experiences that would tap into the treasury for sort of community members who were as a part of that network. And that's sort of when we started to get dubbed this, decentralized Soho House, which was like a framework, but still felt limiting because we didn't know what it was, and we kept we do these monthly town halls where we all come together as a community and on Discord and kind of walk through major items or discussion points, sort of run like a board meeting, but if all your users were your board, and would talk about, learnings and findings and things we wanted to prioritize. And one of the first things was just sort of understanding, like, okay, I remember someone raised their hand and was like, don't define what this is yet. Just keep letting it grow organically. And in the moment you call it something it is, it'll be something that it isn't for anyone who's like participated in cultural scenes or, music scenes. Is you label it and it's sort of dead. And so at least we just continued to allow for it to be emergent and to grow. We saw a lot of physical events happen. We saw people in the community begin to create physical products and merchandise. So a good example would be some friends who create like a CPG product. We created a custom sort of sparkling yerba mate drink that our community like A/B tested and ultimately took to production, that the DAO owns, I think, like 20% of sort of the IP and equity around that. And wow. That's now being distributed and has a marketing plan and will be sort of on the shelves in different stores. So really just kind of pulling at this notion of what is a new kind of social network looks like that isn't just designed by a sort of a company itself to sort of capture people, but more something that is fluid and emergent, and starts with the people itself, and sort of crosses that lines of new forms of social media, new forms of collectives, cooperatives, unions, groups of people who can work together to sort of accomplish more efficiencies, and sort of more value for the group, as well as, I guess, just the traditional membership club model of patronage into a group that allows for that group to continue to exist and thrive. And so now we're building a lot of our own technology and a lot of our own social primitives, identity, social networking, stuff that will add value and accentuate value for the community, all built with the community, and in hopes of continue to sort of create just more alignment between all stakeholders of this experiment.
So fascinating. And so all of these experiences, events, these assets that you purchased, that was all done through the FWB token?
Through the treasury, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, so what happened was that, I guess when there was increasing activity in the community, more people wanted to get in, they started buying the token started increasing in value, so you were able to use part of the treasury to, like in other ways. Is that
Yeah, we'll use the treasury to distribute tokens to community members for folks who wanted to get involved more, or contribute as a way to kind of internally circulate the currency. We did a treasury diversification round, which was selling the token for a more stable currency like USDC or Ethereum, so that we could, unfortunately, vendors or event venues won't take crypto assets as down payments quite yet, but being able to take that, swap that into a stable currency, exchange that into fiat, and then be able to put a down payment for an event is things that we've done as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, all sort of through the main treasury function of Friends with Benefits.
It's so fascinating how you can create this sort of microeconomy through something that just started as this group of friends on Discord and has grown into something that just has generated value. And I think it's I've been covering crypto for a long time, from 2017 ICO days, and there was this time when it was like, okay, everyone's launching a token, and you're kind of inserting this token in this pre-existing company and trying to find kind of a use for it, and there was a time when token was a bad word, and ICO was a bad word, maybe it still is, but the idea was you don't really need a native token. Why don't just use Bitcoin or just use ETH? But I think Friends with Benefits is a good example of a way that a native token actually makes sense. You're using it in this economy that makes it kind of self-sustaining, and that you're actually leveraging it to grow now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, especially to draw connections to sort of the 17 ICO, days and vibes. But I think a couple things come to mind. I mean, one, as someone who's participated in a lot of different community experiments, I've always been, I've come to understand that I think communities shouldn't be thought of as businesses, but should be thought of more as economies. And that instead of thinking about, couching a community project or a community or a group of people inside of a relatively outdated framework, in my opinion, of an LLC or a C Corp, in which it exists to generate profit to sort of shareholders, and even the way the governance is structured of it doesn't really feel to me like it could actually take into effect what's even happened over the last 10 years of even social media, right? The idea of how value gets distributed and accrues. And instead, I think what tokens are doing, and I don't know if they're the end all be all, is creating the tools for communities to function more as economies. So for instance, we think a lot less about what does profit margin look like at FWB. We think a lot more of what does GDP look like, or what does the net income of every individual member look like, where what is velocity of the network in which people are using and transacting in FWB, as opposed to a traditional business would exist to just create profit, obviously amongst other other things based on its values. And so that, I think, creates an interesting use case for why tokens, NFTs, some of these on-chain movable assets. And second, from a more sort of philosophical community perspective, which I like to ruminate on, is I think also communities often start from places of gifting, right? And I think there's if you study a lot of really interesting groups of people that have emerged, a lot of it initiates where you're trading seashells between people, or you're gifting people, you're giving people experiences to things, as opposed to necessarily financializing something off the bat. And I think tokens present an interesting way where, like FWB, for its first 3-4 months, everything was just being gifted. It was more of a means of, hey, you want to come contribute, we'd love to give you these tokens. And instead of necessarily overly financializing everything on sort of the front end. And I think tokens kind of present that more implicit mechanic that a lot of people don't think about, where, a lot of people's first entrance into the Ethereum or Bitcoin ecosystem is like a friend giving them, a little bit of Ethereum, or an artist listing artwork and getting paid in Ethereum. I think that those sort of softer mechanics, I think, support at least my belief that, a lot of these community models should be thought of as more economic institutions, as opposed to like just straight up businesses, which building those in Web3 formats give you a lot more optionality for sort of those use cases and behaviors.
Oasis.app aims to be the most trusted entry point to the Maker protocol and to DeFi. Today, on Oasis app, you can do much more than just borrow DAI. You can also use Multiply to change exposure to your collateral, and Earn to increase Uniswap v3 trading fee earnings with your DAI. And if you're an Oasis app user already, you can refer friends and get 5% of fees they generate in DAI forever. To swap crypto, a user has to choose among hundreds of DEXs on multiple networks, all offering different rates and fees. Do you want to avoid that hassle? Swap on 1inch, a DEX aggregator built to get you better rates than any single DEX. Enjoy unlimited liquidity across multiple networks and top-level security. Get 1inch on your phone now, or swap on 1inch.io.
A common criticism of Web3 is that it over-financializes communities and social media. To join Friends with Benefits, a user has to hold 75 FWB in their Ethereum wallet. At its peak, this would total to $14,000, and at current prices, the amount has dropped to roughly $600. In both cases, these levels can be considered a prohibitive price for most people. What does Alex think of this exclusive feature in Web3?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely a challenge that most Web3 sort of projects face, is they become sort of victims of their own success, where when they become successful, they sort of price out the core audience that they initially wanted to attract when FWB started, 0.00 cents or whatever. And so I think, we've taken specific approaches that throughout our sort of history, in that, we've had active sort of grants programs and fellowships programs, and, ways to sort of anyone, with need-based and merit-based being able to sort of apply and receive tokens that come from sort of the community treasury, and a whole donor program of people who have donated tokens, as well as creating clear pathways where people can earn tokens to join through contribution. But the larger issue of sort of gentrification, digital gentrification, which is a whole other thing I'm super interested in, is super prevalent. And I think it's also understanding that, for certain things, at least within our ecosystem, we think of them in sort of different accessibility tiers, where I think to participate in sort of the core governance and the core sort of decision making and everything, there's this sort of a price point that fluctuates with the market and everything. But the goal of it is to, as a group, create sort of goods and products and services that anyone is able to sort of access and reach and touch. So, for instance, our events that we organize all around the world, members get to come for free. But if you just want to go to it, it's like 1 or 2 FWB. It's like $10, $20, $30, whatever it might be. So I think it's just thinking about ways in which you can still retain value for a core group of people, because at the end of the day, they created that value since its inception. But also to continue to create surfaces in which people can interact, engage, with it in a much more sort of inclusive and welcoming way. But for now, haven't necessarily or explicitly solved that, and think a lot about, how do you create exclusivity to create inclusivity? And I know that might be counterintuitive, but I think a lot about like, if everything were inclusive in this world, I don't think anything would have meaning. Obviously, like decreasing socioeconomic barriers is always something important, but and just creating an elitist sort of rich person club isn't at all interesting to us. Knowing that FWB's demographic makeup most is like, 30-40% artists and creatives who have sort of earned their way through it or sold work and then been able to join. But I definitely think a core value proposition or whatever of FWB is that once you're in there, it is probably one of the most diverse and welcoming spaces inside of Web3. And that is something that we think if we just opened it up, it was like come one, come all, I think it starts to look like the rest of crypto Twitter or the internet, right, which kind of has its own flavor that we try to zig while that zags.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting balance to strike, or kind of this tension between, you don't want the old model where it's a social media network that's free for everyone, but paid with ads, and that means the owners are kind of in a way exploiting or using their audience to sell their information and sell ads that way. So it's like, okay, you're using a network for free, but it's not really free. Like you're paying by giving up part of your information, part of your privacy. And now kind of on Web3, it's not free, but at least you're not giving up your privacy and your information for kind of the owners of the network to be able to sell ads. So it's kind of that, pros and cons of both systems, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to clarify, like right now we're not trying to build like a replacement to Facebook in terms of like from a platform level, like because the business model or the operating model we're in wouldn't work for that, because I do think there are free social media alternatives beyond an advertising-based model. But I think at least our approach has been, if we start with our community first, the people who have sort of brought the most emotional energy and labor and creative energy and labor into the equation, and we co-create goods and products and services, that might lead to the formation of a more interesting subculture that sort of builds its own tools and doesn't sort of create an excess, which I think might not fit for every community out there. We're not trying to create a Discord equivalent. I think we're just trying to create an alternative to, we organized this community festival about a month ago outside of Los Angeles for the community, where we had speakers and a lot of musicians and performers who were in the community who were there. And I heard someone say like, oh, this is a festival that I want to go to until I get old. Like when I want to just I can grow kind of old with it. I thought that was a really interesting way to describe an event. And it also made me think about what are like technological platforms that I want to kind of grow old with, where it's like, there's certain platforms that I enjoy using at a certain moment in time, but I don't see it being something that I have a healthy relationship with over, 10, 20, 30 years. We're really interested in taking that approach of like, what is a social experience, a digital social experience that you can sort of grow old with, that allows for you to slide in and out, that isn't sending you push notifications to try to pull you back in if you haven't checked into something in 4 days or in 24 hours. We're more interested in something that is a lot more sort of patient and responsive and emergent with whatever level of contribution you want to participate in. It offers you multiple different surfaces to engage with beyond just like chatting in an app.
And so going back to this analogy of FWB as a city, you mentioned you have exports, right? So these things that you're creating. Can you, and I imagine that's tied to the way that you're thinking about friends with benefits in the future and kind of what you want to build. So what are some of these exports that you're building, like more specifically?
Yeah. We were sort of chatting about how, I guess with the city analogy, one way to think about GDP or sort of income would be, like what's the import-export business? What's the taxation model? How do you tax perhaps exports that drive and accrue value back into sort of a collective treasury? In that exercise, the first thing, I don't know, when building when any city or town goes through the exercise, is like, what is a natural resource that, that is sort of inherent and contains abundance with, I guess, whether, I don't know, in a traditional city analogy, like wood or whatever. I think for us, it was definitely like, we were like, okay, clearly it's like creativity. And I know it's abstract, but creativity can kind of be pulled down into artists and IP. And so an early thing, an early way in which we would demonstrate that was, we created our own sort of gallery surface of Friends with Benefits, where artists within the community, writers, painters, animators would be able to auction, list work there. We would curate it, we'd list it, and we'd sort of promote it collectively as a unit. And the kind of thesis was like, oh, if an artist lists something on a gallery and you have 3,000, 4,000 people sort of distributing it, would that lead to a more interesting outcome for that artist? And what we saw was, we worked with Nadia from Pussy Riot. She put up a really interesting auction piece. We worked with Matthew Ball, who just recently put out a metaverse book, and he auctioned off his first sort of essay on the metaverse that he wrote 4 years ago. And each of those, commanded pretty meaningful auction prices of, I think, around 100 ETH or something, and with a percentage of that going back into the treasury. And so that was kind of an experiment of like, if you would a creator be more interested in a higher take rate or a higher sort of commission fee if it went back to a collective group of people as opposed to a platform, and if that group could help sort of promote that work and was aligned and incentivized socially and financially to promote that work. And so, kind of roundabout way of being like, yeah, I think we worked with a lot of artists and creatives to launch different creative projects that ultimately would accrue value back in the treasury, and we viewed that almost as like things we were exporting to individuals outside of the network.
So interesting. Are you planning on doing more of these galleries?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
What about your ticketing system? So you've mentioned you were one of the first communities to do these token-gated physical events. Is that something that you would think to white label and offer to other communities?
Yeah, so that's another example of sort of the export business model. That party I mentioned we threw in Miami, it was such a nightmare at the door trying to process who held tokens, who didn't. There were people showing us their MetaMask, and we were like, is that a screenshot? It was like a total nightmare. And within 2 to 3 weeks, some community members inside of the Discord reached out to us and like, hey, we built a ticketing app that I think solves this. And it was a lightweight thing. It wasn't a mobile app, but it was just like a web browser experience where it would essentially run an RSVP process for you, verify the correct balance of tokens that you held in that wallet, and then in real time verify via Etherscan that you did in fact hold that attached to your identity, and then grant you access into the physical event. And we were all like freaking out because we were like, we just created something new and exciting. And so we then turned it into a sort of a product that's now, FWB has a whole decentralized events program now where community members around the world are throwing their own events, from running clubs to sake tasting workshops to, whatever the community wants to do. And this ticketing app has now powered over 30,000 different event RSVPs within our network. And we've begun to white label it or offer other communities who want to use it to token gate or NFT gate their different events and experiences. And so the plan is, as that kind of reaches, exits beta, to sort of attach a taxation onto that. Mm-hmm. If you aren't a community member or you aren't inside of FWB and you're more enterprise, you just want to use this technology that our community created, that will then drive kind of more recurring revenue back into the DAO.
So interesting.
The Alio blockchain allows for zero-knowledge smart contracts that are private by default and executed entirely off-chain. With its development tools, Alio is making it super easy to build private and scalable applications. Developers without previous cryptographic knowledge can take advantage of Alio Studio and of Alio's own smart contract language, Leo. Builders and users alike should not have to make compromises between convenience and privacy. Learn more by joining the Discord at alio.org/discord or heading directly to www.alio.studio.
In the past few years, we've seen a boom in Web3 communities sprouting from DeFi, DAOs, and NFTs. We're still in an experimental phase in this regard, meaning there are no strict rules and practices. So I was curious about how Alex found running a DAO in this environment, given the less hierarchical and structureless nature found in Web3 communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of those components. I think DAOs are, especially since we're so early, like most are incredibly inefficient, and just being in any sort of frontier category, means that you're kind of figuring out everything kind of on the fly. I think the right way to approach that sort of question or framing is first to start with, is what you're trying to accomplish actually benefited by making it a DAO or having it operate as a DAO? And then second, there's a huge gradient or spectrum within the category of a DAO in which it can be a fully decentralized DAO or a semi-decentralized DAO, or even a DAO that is relatively centralized but has decentralized components. Because in this current stage, the DAO as a labeling term is still so vague that, to an example with Uniswap, where it has a DAO component, but it has a centralized, just straight up C Corp attached to it. So there's a lot of different hybrid models that people are experimenting and pushing forward. I think in that gradient of decentralization, the most helpful thing that I found in my discussions have just been trying to really match the advantages that the structure of a DAO gives you as a community, as an operator, as an organization, and really thinking long and hard about if that is meaningful to your goals or objectives of what you're trying to create. So as an example, I think DAOs for very specific driven things like creating great, amazing products is super hard. Tragedy of the commons, decentralized decision-making is a nightmare when great products, I think, are built by teams who get really excited with something and just ship and iterate and improve. I think for a form factor for a format like content or media or IP or social networking, where it is significantly more user-generated, I think DAOs offer really interesting frameworks. And through that governance and through that value accrual and all that, all those outcomes. So I would say for most cases, it should not be a DAO. I would say for certain instances where you really think the organization would benefit from having a more sort of trustless decision-making framework that is bottoms up from its users. Like I think content and storytelling is a really great option for that. The stakes are low. Let the users sort of decide what directions they want to see things go in terms of content creation. Let users create their own content. The meme of memes sort of framework. But for more traditional things, definitely not ideal. Friends with Benefits, as an example, has gone through multiple different iterations of this. It started incredibly centralized. It was a founder with a group of people around who made decisions on behalf of the community. Once it sort of picked up its decentralized nature, and now we're working to more progressively sort of decentralize that over time. I think most of these things are amorphous in their early stages, but for most instances, yeah, I think DAOs aren't really optimal because they're still so clunky and nascent.
For you guys, was it more about starting centralized and then having these, the centralized group set kind of a framework for which the community could just pick up and then run with it? Or I guess more specifically, how have you found that you've been able to gradually decentralize like you have?
Yeah, totally the framework first, and then build the framework centrally, and then allow for the community to sort of decentrally populate it. Has at least been our approach. So an example of that would be, we started to throw parties and events and gatherings. We're good at them. We have a lot of experience in throwing these events. After a few months, we began to allow other people in the community to throw events through a sort of a permitting process. So if you applied for an event permit or an event key, you could then throw an event in a city, and that would all aggregate and coalesce on a global calendar. And now, stepping into sort of the next season, we're preparing to sort of exit even more of that, where now it won't even need to be people selecting the events. It's just if you throw an event, you can earn sort of tokens or compensation for organizing that event. So sort of us starting the blueprint, creating the framework, and then decentralizing the event formation process to the community over time, once that proper sort of incentive system is put in place.
Awesome. I think it's so interesting how you've been able to become a more decentralized organization, but through just a very organic process. And then to just, start wrapping up, I'd love just your long-term vision for Friends with Benefits. Like, what would you want it to be like, I don't know, 10 years? Like, where do you see it going?
Yeah, we talk about this a lot as a team, and everyone has sort of different perspectives and hopes and dreams and aspirations. But for me personally, like, I'm just really excited about like creating alternatives to new social like constructs or networks, right? I think this idea of you being a part of this kind of digital community or environment that you check in on, and I don't know, at its max is like 10,000 people or 20,000 people, that can create amazing global things that reach, people and create an impact all over the world, but doesn't need to be these like giant networks. I think that's something really interesting to me, and hopefully continuing to push forward on new formats that, let thousands of other, squads bloom or communities sort of grow. I think also, an early framework we've had in terms of a vision was always kind of this like conglomerate or parent organization where things spawn out of FWB that attribute value back into the community, but that kind of go off and do their own thing. And like this, yerba mate drink that was created, like, what does that look like in 10 years where there's dozens and dozens and dozens of interesting software, physical goods, physical products, experiences that sort of come out of this event, come out of this sort of group of individuals that sort of all feed back into itself. And what does that structure look like? Like, that's super interesting to me in terms of like, what does a futuristic kind of community-owned LVMH look like, where it is this kind of like conglomerate of really interesting consumer-oriented products, goods, and experiences. But yeah, at the end of the day, like, I think we all are excited and ambitious about a lot of this stuff, but also at its core, like, we're just kind of continually curious to see how it evolves and grows, and always wanting to do things differently, as opposed to just kind of replicating things of the past. And it hasn't been perfect, but it's at least been really, really fun.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to, speak with a CEO of an organization that is not looking for, for like everyone in the world to join its thing. It's like, okay, we're not looking for like 10 million users in 10 years. It's more about, okay, this kind of smaller group of people who can just build or produce things that are interesting, and who knows kind of where that goes. But I'm still interested to kind of understand, like, what's the common denominator for that small group of people? Because, okay, you're creating yerba mate, you're creating kind of events, you're creating software, and it's like all these different products, but what do you think is kind of the one thing that is binding these, group of individuals together?
Yeah, I think the common thread that runs through all of us is we all believe in sort of the promise of this better internet, right? A lot of us come from various different connective points of internet native experiences, and we're really interested in culture's role in that, right? I think early on, FWB's tagline was, the cornerstone of crypto and culture, and it was just people who come from cultural spaces who were interested in how Web3 could actually create better outcomes for individuals. We were interested in, can technology meaningfully impact or empower or liberate artists or creatives? So I think at its core is it's this group of people who enjoy being first, who enjoy figuring things out, who still are optimistic about better alternatives to what currently exists from sort of a social and a digital perspective. And we have this saying in sort of our community run application process where, at FWB, we ask, like, what is crypto the least interesting thing about you? Like, we're really looking for people who just are understand that crypto is a tool, not sort of the ends or the end state, right? Where we say we're a community that uses crypto, not a crypto community. So I think the common denominator is sort of those shared beliefs and those values, and the desire to sort of implement those values in real life.
Right. So interesting. I wonder kind of how that looks like in 10 years, like if Web3 is actually just like mainstream. Like it's not kind of the next thing, but I guess, yeah, then kind of this community will be looking at Web 4, or I don't know, whatever that will be.
Yeah, Web 6.
Right. Okay, well, this has been fascinating, Alex. Thank you so much for joining the Defiant podcast. And yeah, thanks everyone here who came
Thanks for
as
having me.
well. Yeah.